On a cold February morning in 1985, a Boeing 727 carrying 148 passengers and crew slips into the foggy abyss of the mountains of northern Spain. And in this abyss lies a deadly surprise. The pilots are seconds away from finding out that they have made a grave error. How did they make this mistake? And why hasn't the captain said a word for over 100 kilometers? This is the strange story of Iberia Flight 610. Thank you. On the morning of February 19, 1985, 141 passengers boarded a Boeing 727, operated by Iberia at Madrid's Barajas Airport in Spain. They were bound for Bilbao in the north of the country, just about an hour away. As the passengers took their seats, they were unaware that opened the cockpit. A silent storm was brewing. Sitting up front in the left-hand seat was 51-year-old Captain José Luis Patino. He had been flying with Iberia for 19 years and had amassed over 13,000 hours of flying. Time since starting his career, he was described by colleagues as being an excellent pilot, but on this flight, he would exhibit some strange behavior. His behavior would be so unusual, in fact, that it would put him at the center of a nationwide controversy. In the following weeks and months, sitting to Patino's right was 38-year-old First Officer Emilio López Pena. He had over 5,000 hours of flying experience, 2,000 of which were on the 727. Despite his experience on this morning, López Pena would make a mistake, which studies by NASA had warned about for years. Sitting behind the two pilots at the flight engineer station was 38-year-old Gregorio Arobo Martin. He was the least experienced of the crew, with just under 3,000 hours of flying time, all of which ran the 727. Despite the strangeness of the events which would unfold over the next hour, all was more or less normal, as the pilots worked through their checklists and prepared their aircraft for a departure. At 20 minutes to 9 that morning, Flight 610 pushed back from the gate at Madrid. This would be a relatively busy flight for the pilots. Short duration meant that a large proportion of the flight would be taken up by the high workload events surrounding takeoff and landing. For the captain, it would be especially demanding, as this was one of his first flights in over 6 months. We'll get into why that was in a few moments. This episode is sponsored by War Thunder. War Thunder is the most comprehensive online vehicle combat game ever made, with more than 2,000 vehicles, including planes, helicopters, tanks, and ships. I really like how detailed the vehicles are. They're modeled down to their individual components, each of which can be damaged in battle, which makes for some exciting gameplay. I've also enjoyed how much interaction there is between all the vehicles in the game. If you like flying the planes like I do, you'll get shot at by other players playing as ships at sea and tanks on the ground. So it's a really active world. The 4K graphics are great, and the authentic sound effects really give the game an immersive atmosphere. It's free to play on PC, Xbox Series X and S, PlayStation 5, and the previous console generation. Click my link in the description to play War Thunder. For free on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox, you get a large free bonus pack by signing up with my link, which includes multiple premium vehicles, a premium account boosters, and much more. As Flight 610 takes it out to the runway at Madrid, the passengers had no reason to suspect that anything was out of the ordinary. However, events which they had been reading about in the newspapers over the past few months were soon about to affect them directly. The previous summer, a number of Iberia pilots had gone on strike in opposition to layoffs at the company. As retaliation for this, Iberia had fired some of these striking pilots, and sitting up in the cockpit of Flight 610 was one of them. Captain Patino had been reinstated a few months previously, but as we'll see shortly, all was not well between him and his employer. At just before 10 to 9 that morning, First Officer López Pena lined the aircraft up with the runway and applied takeoff thrust. Within moments, the plane was rocketing skywards, and the first officer steered it north towards Bilbao. Flight 610 would arrive in less than 45 minutes. Shortly after departure, the pilots reached their cruising altitude of 26,000 feet. They began chatting, and the flight attendant brought them coffee. The contents of their conversation have never been released, but we can hazard a guess about them by noticing a difference in the captain's demeanor before the conversation and after it. Before this conversation took place, he appeared to be participating fully in the operation of the aircraft. He made radio-caused air traffic control, and he acted as a second set of eyes and ears to aid the first officer in flying the aircraft. But once this conversation had taken place, there was a stark difference in the captain's level of involvement. In fact, he became almost completely silent from this point. In a few minutes, his passivity would take an even more serious form. The aircraft being used for this flight was a 6-year-old Boeing 727. The 727 was a popular short to medium-haul aircraft, and Iberia had 23 of them, which it used extensively on its European and North African routes. It was a reliable plane which could get in and out of small airports with ease, but the ones Iberia owned were behind the times in some important ways. For one thing, it had an antiquated altimeter, which displayed the plane's altitude in a rather confusing way. This drum pointer instrument displayed the plane's altitude by showing thousands of feet in this window here, and hundreds of feet using a clock-style pointer, for example. Right now, as the pilots were in the cruise, their altimeter shows 26 in this window, meaning 26,000 on this dial, meaning that they are exactly at 26,000 feet. If they were at 26,300 feet, it would look like this many pilots had expressed frustration at using this type of altimeter because it required them to look twice at their instrument rather than just once. This made it liable to being misread on a typical altimeter. There is an hour hand to indicate thousands of feet and a minute hand to indicate hundreds of feet. This requires just a quick glance to read and is far less likely to be misread. Another important change had also not been implemented, which we'll take a closer look at as the plane nears Bilbao. At 9:07 that morning, the first officer contacted the airline's operations center at Bilbao. He told them that he was expecting to land in 17 minutes, and he requested the weather information at the airport, as was typical for February in the north of Spain. The weather was cold and foggy. These conditions were less than ideal, but the pilots were well used to landing in them. They would just need to be vigilant during approach, as the airport was surrounded by mountains, which they would now be unable to see. The pilots briefed their arrival into Bilbao, looking over their approach charts and planning their route. But unbeknownst to them, there was something missing from their charts, something which lay lurking in the clouds 3 minutes after getting the weather information. Flight 610 was cleared to begin its descent into Bilbao. But this is when things went from relatively normal to somewhat strange normally. One pilot flies the plane and the other talks to air traffic control. Yet for some reason, on this flight, First Officer Lopez Pena was doing both jobs. Since that conversation earlier in the flight, the captain had remained curiously silent, however. There was one part of the plane's operation the Captain Patina was staying on top of. He went about setting up the autopilot to get the aircraft to descend. He did this by twisting the dial beside the altitude window here until it read 10,000 feet. Then he pressed the altitude select button here, which instructed the aircraft to level off when it reached 10,000 feet. In a matter of minutes, they would be in Bilbao. The flight attendant announced the passengers that they will be landing shortly. Nobody on board had any idea that over the next few minutes the pilots would make a series of unlikely missteps, which would endanger the lives of everyone on the plane. A few minutes into the descent, First Officer Lopez Pena contacted the tower controller and told him that they were descending through 13,000 feet on their way down to $10,000. We're now about to see why the captain had been so silent. Up until this point, the controller cleared the crew to descend to 7,000 feet and asked whether they would like a shortcut to the runway. Let's take a look at the area surrounding the airport so we can understand this shortcut. Bilbao's airport is surrounded on 3 sides by tall mountains for planes to approach it safely. They have to follow a predefined path. This involves flying directly to a navigation beacon located at the airport while maintaining at least 7,000 feet. Then the procedure dictates that once the plane has reached this beacon, it should fly away from it for 24 kilometers to what's known as the approach fix, which is a waypoint on the extended center line of the runway. As the plane flies towards the approach fix, it can descend to 5,000 feet. Then, on reaching the approach fix, It should execute a 180-degree turn to line up with the runway while descending to 4,400 feet. This procedure was quite straightforward, and it kept playing safely above the mountainous terrain throughout. But on this day, the traffic at the airport was light, and the controller offered the pilots a shortcut. He said that if they wanted, they could fly directly to the approach fix and then continue on into the runway. It was actually quite common for controllers at Bilbao to offer this to pilots when traffic conditions permitted. In fact, it was so common that the first officer had taken this shortcut more often than he'd flown the full procedure. So when the controller asked him if he wanted to take it, he was just about to accept when he caught sight of the captain, who motioned at him to take the standard procedure instead. Was it that the captain thought the shortcut was unsafe? After all, it was foggy in the valley leading up to the runway. Maybe it would be better to play it safe and stick to the standard procedure. Well, that wasn't the first officer's first thought. In fact, his first thought had to do not with the fight in that moment, but months back the previous summer, he knew that the captain had been one of the pilots who Iberia had fired for going on strike. And crucially, since reinstating him a few months ago, the airline had not been paying him. The first officer asked the captain, "Have they paid you? Have they given you back your pay?" The captain made a gesture indicating that they hadn't paid him, and the first officer told air traffic control, "We'll make the standard maneuver." It might seem bizarre that the captain of a passenger jet was making flight-related decisions out of spite for his company, but this practice wasn't uncommon in Iberia. At the time, the first officer went on to tell Patino that just 2 days beforehand he had flown with another captain, who would also be on strike, and who had not received his pay from the airline, and who had rejected a shortcut for that reason. There was a semi-coordinated effort among some of the fired pilots, the accused, as the first officer called them, to cost the airline time and money by refusing shortcuts and other time-saving measures from air traffic control, not wanting to rock the boat any further. The first officer turned to the fight engineer, and both men began working through the descent checklist. The captain remained silent. The controller acknowledged the crew's intention to fly the full arrival procedure and asked them to report when they were over the beacon. He needed them to tell him this because back in 1985, Bilbao didn't have radar, as such controllers had to rely on position reports from pilots in order to get an idea of where the aircraft were in their airspace. Despite his silence, there was one task the captain did stay on top of. This was setting up the altitude alert system. The altitude alert system is linked to the autopilot, and like the name suggests, it alerts the pilots when they are nearing or deviating from their selected altitude. In this case, the crew were descending to 7,000 feet, when the plane had 900 feet left to go on its descent. The altitude alert system emitted a 2-second aural tone, and a light illuminated here. In the cockpit, this light stayed on until the plane had 300 feet left to go, indicating that it was about to level off at its selected altitude. If for whatever reason the descent continued below the selected altitude, the light would begin to flash on and off as a way of alerting the pilots they had deviated from their chosen altitude. All was well with this system, as the pilots descended to 7,000 feet, en route to the beacon, as the pilots descended the atmosphere. In the cockpit was calm. Captain Patino had begun absent-mindedly singing a Spanish song, "Like a Bear." While in the passenger cabin, a flight attendant updated the passengers on the weather and told them to fasten their seat belts. They would be on the ground in a matter of minutes. As Flight 610 near the Bilbao radio beacon, the first officer notified the tower that he was beginning to join the standard arrival procedure. He then instructed the autopilot to turn the plane to the right and fly away from the beacon. Meanwhile, the captain put 5,000 feet in the autopilot's altitude window, and the aircraft began descending at a leisurely rate of 1,000 feet per minute. So far, everything was going to plan. But over the next few seconds, those oddities. I mentioned before the outdated altimeter, the silent captain, and the choice of the standard approach path would all conspire to put the aircraft in grave danger. As the aircraft reached 5,000 feet, the captain dialed back the altitude selector to 4,300 feet, which was the next altitude called for. In the approach path, we focused on the behavior of the captain so far. But now it was the first officer's turn to do something strange. He dialed in at a ascent rate of 1,500 feet per minute, considering that they were already at an altitude of 5,000 feet and only had to descend to 4,300. At a ascent rate of 1,500 feet per minute was unnecessarily steep. So why did the first officer choose to descend so fast? The answer to this question lies just a few moments ago, when the controller offered the pilot a shortcut. Normally, the first officer would have opted to take the shortcut, which involved flying directly to the approach fix, and then heading for the runway to ensure that they remain clear of the surrounding mountains. Planes taking this shortcut had to remain at an altitude of 7,000 feet until they reached the approach fix. From there, they would descend steeply to 4,300 feet, while looping back towards the runway. This was the method the first officer had grown familiar with, but today his captain had opted to take the standard approach, and on the standard approach, planes reach the approach fix, not at 7,000 feet, but at 5,000 as such. They only had to lose 700 feet during the loop to the runway. However, as it turned out, the first officer was so used to taking the shortcut that he had begun to associate being at the approach fix with entering a rapid descent. His unconscious mind simply told him, if you're at the approach fix now, you have to descend quickly to make it down to 4,300 feet by the time you've lined up with the runway. And that's exactly what happened when Flight 610 reached the approach fix, this time at just 5,000 feet. The first officer selected his usual descent rate of 1,500 feet per minute, and the plane began descending. However unfortunate this oversight was, though it shouldn't have presented much of an issue. After all, it was perfectly safe for the plane to be at 4,300 feet. At any point during the loop, all the first officer had done was to tell the autopilot to get down faster. But on this flight, this small mistake would end up having vastly outsized consequences, all because of what the captain did next. For whatever reason, be a distraction or simple forgetfulness, when Captain Patino selected 4,300 feet on the autopilot, he didn't follow this up by pressing the altitude select button. This meant that the plane would simply continue descending without regard to the altitude dialed into the window with every passing second. The plane was drawing closer to the mountains below. Both pilots were oblivious to the fact that it had not been told to level off at 4,300 feet. But the plane was far from doomed at this point. Think back to the altitude alert system from a few moments ago and how it alerts pilots with an oral tone when they have deviated from their selected altitude on the 727. An arrow tone sounds when the plane has descended more than 300 feet below the selected altitude, less than a minute after the pilots began their descent. This arrow tone sounded right as the plane passed below 4,000 feet. But here's where the first officer's mental model of the situation again caused him to miss something important. When he heard this sound, he thought it was the tone telling him that he was now 900 feet above his selected altitude, as the same tone was used for both of these alerts. This was completely in line with what he expected, as he would usually have begun the descent from 7,000 feet and would expect to be hearing that tone around now. So to him, hearing it was confirmation that he now had 900 feet to go until he reached 4,300 feet. He had no idea that in fact it was telling him that he was now 300 feet below his selected altitude and getting lower by the second. Responding to this sound, the first officer reduced the air cross rate of descent from 1,500 feet per minute to 750 feet per minute. As he expected that it would be leveling off soon, he started the turn back to the airport, which involved first a left turn followed by a right-hand loop to line up with the runway. All while he carried out this maneuver, the plane was drifting steadily downwards despite all of this, though there were still two things that should have alerted the pilots to their situation. The first of these was their altimeters. There were 3 of them in the cockpit, 1 for captain, 1 for first officer, and 1 backup. It was the duty of the non-flying pilot, in this case Captain Patino, to monitor the altimeter while the first officer flew the plane. But in keeping with his general lack of involvement throughout the approach, he didn't do this. The first officer was left with both the flying duties and the radio duties with air traffic control, and in this high workload situation, it's quite possible that the first officer simply misread his altitude, as being higher than it actually was. This would have been easy to do, given the advocated design of the altimeter. In fact, in surveys of pilots, over 80% had admitted to misreading this style of altimeter. Nonetheless, it's highly unlikely that both Patino and Lopez Pina misread their altimeters in the same way. Either one pilot or both pilots simply weren't keeping an eye on their altitude. As the plane slipped below 4,300 feet, hidden in the clouds all around them were towering mountains, the peaks of which they were now descending below. But there was one last line of defense: the Ground Proximity Warning System. This is a sensor installed on the underside of the aircraft which alerts pilots when it attacks rapidly rising terrain beneath the aircraft, say, when it flies towards a mountainside. When the pilots hear this alert, their response is to rapidly put the aircraft into a steep climb. And that's exactly what the pilots of Flight 610 would have done at this moment. Were it not for one important thing: their aircraft did not have a Ground Proximity Warning System, so the plane continued its descent below the minimum safe altitude, as the mountains obscured by fog began to crowd around it. But the ultimate stroke of misfortune had nothing to do with anything we've just looked at, because Flight 610 was not on a collision course with a mountain. In fact, even though the pilots were now 1,000 feet below their selected altitude, they should have been just fine. That is, were it not for an object lurking in the fog, an object which wasn't even on their approach charts at 27 minutes past 9. A television master peered out of nowhere right in front of the plane. There was no time to react. The aircraft's left wing hit the mast and was torn off, sending the plane into an uncontrollable spiral. In a matter of seconds, it was over. Iberia Flight 610, carrying 148 passengers and crew, crashed inverted into the valley of Mount Oes. There were no survivors. The investigation which followed this accident, carried out by Spain's Civil Aviation Accident and Incident Investigation Commission, recommended that airlines properly train the pilot not flying to call out altitudes during descent, so that all crew members maintain situational awareness during this critical phase of flight. It also recommended that the outdated drum and pointer style altimeters be replaced with altimeters which are less likely to be misread, and importantly that the sound used for deviations from the selected altitude be made different than the sound used to tell pilots they had 900 feet left to go. Incredibly, the final report failed to mention the one piece of technology which would almost certainly have prevented the crash: the Ground Proximity Warning System in the United States. This had been mandatory in passenger aircraft for the previous decade, but in Spain, no such requirement existed. It would be another few years before the system was made mandatory in Spain. The introduction of this technology came too late for the passengers and crew of Flight 610. But in large part, thanks to its introduction around the world in the subsequent years, crashes like this have become far less common than they were just a few decades ago. Thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Click my link in the description box to play War Thunder for free on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox. There's a big free bonus for using this link, which includes multiple premium vehicles, a premium account, boosters, and much more. I should also mention that you don't need any special hardware to play. A mouse and keyboard is all you need. I want to say a special thanks to the Patreon and YouTube members for making it possible for my team and I to keep producing these in-depth videos. If you'd like to help us make more, you can support Aviation on Patreon. I've put the link here on screen. I'd especially like to thank Joey Steve Wilcox, Simon Burbage, Matt O'Callahan, and Pete Familton for their very generous support. I hope you enjoyed this one, and I'll see you soon for the next episode.